Hey, Danny.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for picking up. So, so heretofore in the story that we're telling of the first century church, the center of gravity has been Jerusalem. I know we took the detour in baptism, but when we last left off with the Jerusalem Council, we saw that the center of gravity for the church is Jerusalem, right? Because this is where Jesus died and rose from the dead. This is where Pentecost happens. This is from this place is where the gospel goes out, but it's also where the church sort of retracts and comes back in for the council to make some important decisions before going back out again, right?
And
So
baptizing the nations. Yep.
yeah, and we saw that the Gentile mission was now free to just go
Hmm.
and to breathe, and so there's been a lot of success there, but there's still this sort of deference to Jerusalem in a way, right?
Yeah, definitely. Jerusalem holds kind of primacy, and it's because of the events that have taken place there, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also this element of Jesus's relatives, his family,
Mm-hmm.
that hold, I guess you could say, kind of this auctoritas, this authority, this prestige that's there with Jesus's family members, and so we've seen that with already James.
Yeah.
But it's clear that there's other family members of Jesus who are leading this church. I think of Jude, the brother of Jesus. So
Yeah.
James and Jude are brothers, and besides Saint Paul, besides James, besides Peter, and besides John, Jude is the only one in the New Testament who has a letter assigned to his name. So his prominence is there, his prestige is there. We'll get into this, but after James is out of the picture when he's martyred, who takes over? It's Simeon, the son of Clopas, and so that means that Simeon is James's and Jude's cousin. So a cousin takes over the leadership of the church after James is gone.
Yeah, and in the New Testament, we see all these references in St. Paul's letters, to Jerusalem is our mother, right? He says,
Yeah,
and things like
yeah,
that. So Jerusalem clearly still holds this primacy of place
well, yeah.
for
Not
the church.
and not he just doesn't just say it; he proves it too, because Saint Paul is on multiple occasions collecting funds to then send back to the Jerusalem church, kind of almost like a patron-client system, right? That he has to make sure he takes care of
Paul's
the
good at
saints in
politics,
Jerusalem.
man. Paul's
No,
good
he
at
is good.
politics.
He is good. But he is taking up these collections and bringing them to the Jerusalem church. Paul's also checking in at least 3 times throughout his missionary journeys. He goes back to Jerusalem, and the first time he goes back, he wants to make sure he's not running in vain. He wants to double check
Yeah.
that what he's doing is in line with what was received, what was the tradition handed on from Christ himself. So there
Yeah.
is this deference that Saint Paul shows to Jerusalem, and frankly, the whole first century church does.
Yeah, yeah. So you have Jerusalem's prime. Well, let's put primacy in quotes because that's kind of an
Yeah, yeah,
anachronistic term. Let's just use the center of gravity, right? So
yep.
Jerusalem has this center of gravity in the church, and it's based in, like we said, event. But it's also, like you said, the genetic makeup of this community, like literally, like Jesus's relatives. I think a lot of Catholics maybe don't know James the Lord's brother. Like he's called the brother of the Lord. We actually ran into some Catholics recently who were like, I just did not even realize, that this
Yeah,
is the case.
yeah.
Um,
You'll get so usually when it comes to that, Protestants will say that these are his brothers and sisters, um, who are younger than Jesus. So Mary and Joseph had
Born of
relations
Mary.
after Jesus. Yeah, Jesus
Yeah.
was the firstborn, and then the rest of them were born afterwards. Catholics don't believe that. They believe in Mary's perpetual virginity, along with the Eastern Orthodox. And so we have to surmise that these are Joseph's sons and daughters, perhaps from a previous marriage.
Yeah. So that lands us right on James in the tradition because James is clearly, like we said, leading this Jerusalem church. So there is a good solid tradition of this man in many different sources, actually, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely across the spectrum. There's this. I love James because there's this like this mystique about him. There's kind of an aura around him. He
Jesus's
is,
brother. It's like,
yeah, but he has the title James the Righteous, and it's not like a title that the later church gave him. No, it's a title that the earliest church gave to James,
while he's living and
and
breathing.
yeah, and so there's this certainly this deference that's there to James, but there's also this almost like fearful respect of James, and so how where does that play out? You see it again in St. Paul's letters. When St. Paul's having that dispute with Peter, he says that men came from James. Now notice he doesn't indict James. He's very careful with how he clearly deals with James and the struggle that's there in the early debates that we've already gone through. And so you see that in Galatians. The deference is also there in the book of Acts. Look at Acts chapter 12, when St. Peter is miraculously released from prison. The first thing he says, he goes to the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark, and he says to them, first thing, go and tell James and the brothers. Now, typically we think James and then the brothers, as in the rest of the Christians.
Yeah.
But he could really actually be saying, go tell James and the brothers, literally the brothers of Jesus.
The brothers of the Lord.
Who are,
yeah. Right.
The ones who are running the church in Jerusalem. So again, Paul's showing a deference to James. Peter's showing a deference to James. Go tell James that I've been released. He's the one who needs to know this, kind of thing. So it's definitely there in the Bible, and of course we also see it in a great source we'll talk about more in depth in today is Josephus. Right? This second century Christian who actually we think it was a Jewish Christian. And he relates kind of in full the martyrdom of James.
Well, this is the thing. So before you even say it, so Josephus, just so people know, he had 5 books of history of the early church. And when I say the early church, remember, this guy is mid-2nd century.
Yeah.
The history of the church.
All lost to the only way we have it is it's preserved in Eusebius's church history of the 4th century.
Yeah, of the 4th century. We lost almost all of it. I mean, we lost almost all of his 5 books. Can you even imagine what was in there and what the earliest Christians, like even in the 3rd century and 4th century, were reading in Josephus's writings that are now gone? All these great stories that we don't have. So we're just picking this off of the fragments of Josephus.
Yeah, you can tell he had some really juicy traditions that we could have really really clung on to. Yeah, and Eusebius is unique in that sense. Because ancient historians didn't often take wholesale direct quotes and put them into their works. They would usually paraphrase or kind of put it in their own words. We have Eusebius taking whole paragraphs and whole stories from Josephus and putting in. Anyway, that's the uniqueness of Eusebius we'll talk about, I'm sure, down the road. But the respect that's there for James is certainly in Josephus, because Josephus portrays James as the leader of the Jerusalem community. He portrays him as a priest, as a Nazarite, somebody who's kind of chaste and takes these vows of chastity.
Lets his hair grow, doesn't bathe, all these things.
Exactly. He's ruling the church there. So the respect is there in Josephus. You also have, ironically and curiously, Josephus. Now, Josephus, for those who don't know, is a 1st century Jewish historian. Not a Christian historian, a Jewish historian. And it's very interesting. Josephus is known to not name names. He's notorious for this. There are so many people in his narratives. He writes a history of the history of the world, basically from a Jewish perspective, and then he writes the history of the war of the Jews against the Romans. And he notoriously doesn't mention names. And historians are always like curious at that. Like we know that Roman general was there or that emperor was there, and he just doesn't mention names. It's weird.
But and this is what's crazy is that he's known for not mentioning names when we want him to. But in this instance, when he's talking about Jerusalem and the goings on, and he's talking about the Nazarene sect, there are 3 names that he names. Right? John the Baptist, Jesus,
who you would expect, Jesus, who you would expect, and then everybody would think, oh, he's probably going to mention Paul, because Paul was a Pharisee like Josephus was a Pharisee, or he'll mention Peter, right? No, the 3rd person he mentions is James. Yeah. So according to, if we only had Josephus as our source for 1st century Christianity, we would know the names of John the Baptist, Jesus, and James the Righteous. That's it.
Crazy, man.
So you see, the respect that Josephus himself had for James, that he was worth mentioning in his narrative of the history of the Jews, basically. And then I would just throw in another early 2nd century source, the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is a non-canonical gospel, probably written by heretical Gnostic sects, but a lot of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas parallel to a lot that's in the canonical Gospels in our New Testament. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say. So then, just to wrap that up, why we're even mentioning this is that so we know the biblical generation held him in great esteem, right? We have Josephus, which is a great church source. We have Josephus, who's a Jewish source, and then we even have a Gnostic source, all attesting to the greatness and the mystery of this guy.
Well, it's interesting what the Gospel of Thomas says. It's saying 12, and it's a situation where the disciples come to Jesus and they say, "Hey, Lord, when we know you're going to depart, and when you're gone, who will be great among us?" Now, for people who know the New Testament, there's two answers to that question. Either we expect Jesus to say, "Well, the greatest among you will be your servant."
Servant, yeah.
Or number two, "I will send the Paraclete. I will send the Holy Spirit who will guide the church, right?
Yeah.
Into all truth." So that's what we would expect if we know the canonical Gospels. But in this instance, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus replies and says, "Well, wherever you're coming from, you must go to James the righteous, because it was for his sake that heaven and earth were created."
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So it's this wild, assertion. I mean, really, which proves the respect that James had among all these different traditions in the early church. And that's why I say I love. There's just something unique and mystical about who this James character is. You kind of see him in the background of the New Testament. He's he's behind something, or he's mentioned here, or he's mentioned there,
and always a deference. Always a deference,
and a mover and a shaker in the church of the first century.
Yeah. So we've established that Jerusalem, center of gravity. James is sort of at the pinnacle of that. He's the tower of the Jerusalem church. Well, all of this is going to come crashing down inevitably, and so that's the whole point of this episode, is to go through the fall of the Jerusalem church and sort of what that means for these first century Christians after that. So in the city itself, then we have to sort of dive in a little bit about the family feud that's going on. The family of Annas, right?
Yeah. So Josephus, like we said, relates the martyrdom of James in the second century source, and the death of James is very curious for a lot of reasons, but one of those reasons is he is executed under the high priesthood of Annas II. Now, why is that significant? Well, it's significant because Annas II is from the same family as Caiaphas. Okay, so that should ring some people's bells. Caiaphas is the high priest who put the Lord to death.
Yeah.
Okay? Caiaphas's successor from the same family, the Annas family, was Matthias, and Matthias put to death James, the son of Zebedee. Saint Stephen was martyred, probably under Caiaphas as well. So there seems to be something with this high priest, this rich Sadducean family that just doesn't like Jesus, doesn't like Jesus' followers, but more specifically, doesn't like Jesus' relatives. And you see that every time someone from the family of Annas is in the high priesthood, there's a persecution that breaks out in the church.
Yeah.
And so James is put to death.
So you have the family, you have the family of Jesus sort of running this church, which is embarrassing for this family, this high priestly family of Annas.
Caiaphas thought he stamped this out, right? We got rid of Jesus.
Yeah, but now it has broken out, and they're out preaching in the streets and even in the precincts of the temple. So it's embarrassing. We failed. And then on top of it, like we mentioned in our Jerusalem Council episode, this is starting to look a little kooky in the upper city. Things are starting to get a little weird up there, because it's starting to look like a high priest with a Sanhedrin. You're starting to see like James at the center of this thing, and around him is this council of presbyters, right? Because when you look at even Eusebius's list of the bishops, because Eusebius loved doing that. He loved bringing out, the bishops lists, everything that Irenaeus compiled, everything. It's very strange, right? Because it's a short amount of time, but then you see all these names. It's like 15 names or something like that, right? So you sort of have this this central figure, and then it's clear that there's a council there that he's just naming as a succession line of bishops. But it's very possible that what he's mentioning also, he's including a bunch of presbyters who are part of this makeup of the church.
Yeah. So what you have basically, what we're saying is that it appears from the Sadducean view that James is setting up a rival priesthood and Sanhedrin.
Mm-hmm. And a rival with a rival sacrifice, like we said. They're going back and breaking the bread in their homes, and they're saying it's the flesh and blood of Christ, So,
and this is exactly how Josephus reads this thing, because he portrays James as a high priest, praying not just on behalf of Christians in Jerusalem, but actually praying on behalf of all of Israel.
Yeah.
And so he portrays James as a high priest, and he says James's knees were like camels' knees, because he was down on his knees all the time praying for Israel. And again, this emphasizes what we mentioned before about James. James was about the salvation of Israel, that all Israel will be saved. Yeah. And in that, there was a little bit of a difference in emphasis between him and Paul. So James is concentrated on Israel, and we see that in Josephus.
Yeah, because he still believes in this. He still believes in this motif of from Jerusalem will go out the gospel. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So in this martyrdom account, we can actually put together both Josephus and Josephus. Now, Josephus says that Annas takes advantage of the fact that the Roman procurator had died, and the new Roman procurator was coming in from Egypt. And it says that Annas takes the opportunity to go after James and then accuse him of not following the law.
Yeah, okay. See, and it's important for people to understand that the reason he would do that is because the Roman procurators were the real bosses in town. Like the sheriff is in town, right? Like when they come in, you couldn't get away with stoning someone willy-nilly. That's why even when Pontius Pilate is there during the trial of Jesus, they can't just put Jesus. If he wasn't there, I don't know what would happen, but they had to hand him over to Pontius Pilate at that point. So in this case, it's the same thing. But in this case, he's gone, right? There's no one there. There's a vacancy. And so they see their opportunity to sort of seize after James. But remember this too. I don't want people to think that this is just like everyone among the Pharisees and Sadducees is like, let's get James now. It's not like that, like it was with Jesus in a way. There are a lot of people who respect James. And that's why this is a personal vendetta of this family among the priesthood that wants to get James, while the rest of them are like, James is a righteous man.
Well, and this is exactly what you see in Josephus' account. Again, a Jewish historian. Josephus says that not only did Annas II take the advantage of the procurator being gone to then go after James, accuse him, and then try him and stone him, he also says that there were those in Jerusalem who are more level-headed, and by this he's probably referring to people of his own sect, the Pharisees. There are people more level-headed who disagreed with what Annas just did to James, that this shouldn't have been, it was unjust that what they did to him. Yeah. So here you have a Jewish historian defending James against a Sadducean high priest.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, the respect that's there, at least among the Pharisees and the priests of the Pharisees, because Josephus was from a priestly family. And remember, again, who made up that Jerusalem church? James, yes, the relatives of Jesus, yes, but also priestly Pharisees.
Mm-hmm.
In the book of Acts, it tells us that a lot of the priests among the Pharisees became Christians.
Yeah, people should know this too. That the priests in the Sanhedrin continued to be priests of the Sanhedrin, but also just believers that Jesus was this Messiah mm-hmm. figure. So I think it's hard for us because we just see Judaism and Christianity as being these two separate things nowadays. But back then it would be like, oh, so you're one of those people, you're one of the people who sort of believes that Jesus is our Messiah, and then they just go about their business, and some people would see it as a threat. Some people wouldn't really care. And others would be like questioning it, like, well, tell me more about this. So you just have to see it. It's a little convoluted. It's a little, it's a little more interesting than what it is today, where it seems like it's two separate religions or something like that. So let's set the scene then. So James, old camel knees, is arrested, or he's not arrested. He's actually taken and given an opportunity, right?
Yeah. So in Josephus, it just says he was arrested, tried, and then they stoned him. Josephus adds that actually the Jews told James to go up to the temple parapet where he can be seen and heard, and we want you to tell the people that Jesus is not the Son of God. Okay? We want you to deny that, because all these people are starting to believe in Jesus. So go up there and say what you're supposed to say, and then come back down, and everything can be fine again. Okay?
Now, this is the self-same pinnacle, quote unquote, pinnacle of the temple that Satan took Jesus for his temptations. I want people to understand that. So when he takes Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple and says, throw yourself down, right? Because it says in the Psalms that the angels won't let you fall, right? So where Jesus gets tested, that's where they take James. And this is sort of a test, in its own right. So it's sort of I don't know if it's, coincidence or not, but it's interesting. And so
or literary device. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you can imagine, you're standing on the pinnacle of the temple, you're looking towards the actual temple itself. If you would just turn around and pan, what you would see below you is basically just this big courtyard with a mikvah in it, where all the Jews would just sort of assemble and gather outside the temple for buying and selling or whatever they're doing. So it's a great place, in other words, to give a very loud speech to a lot of people at one time. Okay. Yeah. And then just to the left of you would be literally just, it drops off. It's like a cliff. I mean, it's literally the Kidron Valley right there. Right.
Yep, down into the Kidron. Yep. So what happens is that James gets up there, and do you think he denies the Lord? No, he doesn't. He says that Jesus is in fact the Son of God. And so the Jews, and it's kind of unclear, from Hegesippus says it was the scribes and Pharisees, but Josephus is saying it's the Sadducees, actually, the priests, which makes a lot of sense, right? The priests of the temple
that makes
are
sense.
There.
Yeah.
And they then decide to push James off the parapet, the pinnacle of the temple on the southeastern corner. They freak out,
man. They freak out.
Yep. And they push him off, but he survives this thing. He survives the fall. And so then they run after him and start to stone him, throw stones at him, which then lines up with Josephus, right? That Josephus says he was stoned. And then the final blow comes from a fuller's club, somebody who was beating, right? Came and beat James over the head, and that was his death. Now, what's interesting is that Hegesippus says that on the very spot where James died, near the temple, near the sanctuary, he says, is where they buried him. And he says, to this day, his headstone is there. So it's clear that Hegesippus maybe has been there or knows people who have been there and visited James's tomb on the southeastern corner of the Temple Mount. That's there. Now, what's interesting is that archaeology has actually confirmed this. So before, we thought, well, Hegesippus is maybe making this up because, would they really bury people right outside the Temple Mount right there? Well, in fact, archaeologists have found all these tombs in the Kidron Valley, on the west side and on the east side of the Kidron Valley, right below the pinnacle. And the interesting thing about these tombs is that these are tombs of Israel's kings and priests.
Yeah.
So again, archaeology is helping us see and backing up the literary sources that we have, that James was seen as this kind of priestly intercessor, this figure, this leader in Jerusalem, and was given the honor of being buried among the kings and priests of Israel, which the Pharisees and people like Josephus, who maybe were in their own rivalry with the Sadducees, allowed the Christians to take James's body and bury him on the spot as a way to get back at the Sadducees.
Yeah, for sure. Because to a lot of people in the Sanhedrin and beyond, just in the elders of Israel, they saw this as just an outrage, a moral outrage, because he was just known to be a just man. It's like, and again, some of them don't care. Like, they don't care that James has a theory that this Jesus is like the awaited Messiah,
because it's clear that James maintained the law of Moses. He followed the law of Moses, and so did the Jerusalem church.
Yeah,
that wasn't under a debate.
Yeah,
they followed the law of Moses.
Yeah, so it was okay, in other words, for some Jews to think that some other claimant to messiahship was the Messiah. It'd be like, okay, you're a fool, but you're a good Jew, So that's
we can get up with you for a while, but that speaks to a larger point that we should mark out. Persecution in the early church, like the death, the martyrdom of James here, it wasn't systematic in general.
Right.
It was actually specific, and not done in this kind of systematic way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it was occasional. And that's what you see here. So you see a persecution of James, the son of Zebedee. Then you see a persecution of Saint Stephen and some followers. But for 20 years, from about the early 40s to the year 62 when James is martyred, there's no record in the book of Acts, at least, of a major persecution that breaks out.
Yeah.
So for basically almost 2 decades, James and the relatives of Jesus and the priests, priestly Pharisees who are ruling this church are doing so effectively, is what it looks like.
Yeah. So what's really interesting about the Josephus account is that he basically moves pretty seamlessly from the death of James, the murder of James, to the start of the Jewish war with Rome.
Yeah. Even though he wrote the Antiquities, the histories, he wrote it after the Jewish war. It's interesting that he ends his histories at the point where he's ready to start the Jewish war. So it's like the James event is one of the last things that Josephus talks about before it goes into the story of the rebellion against Rome and then the fall of Jerusalem, which led a lot of Christians to see in this James event significance. And the significance is you wiped out the Lord's brother, you wiped out the only intercessor keeping the peace in Israel. And because you've done that, now that you've taken away the great intercessor, this high priestly figure of James, now calamity is going to come upon you. And that's where the church is remembering the prophecies of Jesus.
Yeah. And Origen, actually, later on, later church father in the mid 3rd century, he is outraged by that. Actually, he's like, no, the destruction of Jerusalem happened because they killed Jesus, not because they killed James. but again, it speaks to that just how big of a figure this James person really was, and the death his death was seen as extremely significant to historical goings on in Jerusalem from this point forward. So this is where we're now moving into this collision course between Jerusalem and Rome, right?
Yeah, it's just 1st century Jerusalem and Judea was just this powder keg, just waiting to go off. Ever since the Romans, well, even before that, but ever since the Romans in the early 60s BC under Pompey, when he conquers Judea and Jerusalem, all this, the Romans now rule this as a province. Yeah. And they put these puppet kings to rule over the Jews. Well, the Jews resent that. They resent that. They want to have their own kings. And they want it to be like the Hasmoneans, like the great Maccabean heroes, the great Maccabean martyrs. You know, that's who we are. So when you give us these client kings to rule over us, there's a lot of resentment there. So you have the start of the Zealot movement, and the building of the Zealot, the momentum of the Zealot movement as you're getting into the 60s of the 1st century. Because
they see themselves again in captivity. You know, they now see this as like, holy cow, it's like we went through all that time of the Assyrian captivity. Now we have, the Babylonian captivity, and then the Greeks. It's like, and now we got the Romans. It's like we can never just not be in captivity. So they see this as, and that's why you start to even see like the Qumran sect, right? That this temple, especially that Herod is building, like this temple is a bastardized version of our religion, and so then you see even animosity towards the temple cult, which we've already covered in the past. So that's sort of the political context, and Rome and Jerusalem have been on this collision course for quite some time. You've had multiple insurrections, multiple claimants to messiahship that have been, put down. You have many starting to predict war. Josephus recalls this ancient oracle that predicted the fall of Jerusalem in his history of the Jewish wars. Yeah. And then he also mentions this other feller named Joshua ben Ananiah, who's a prophet in roughly like 60 or 61, 62, somewhere in there. That's AD, right? So it's a little later, a little after Jesus, but he's also predicting that Jerusalem's going to be razed to the ground. It's interesting because he's sort of copying Jesus's prophecy about the fall of Jerusalem. And he also makes a mention of a Jewish prophet from Egypt who expected the walls of Jerusalem to fall. So it's all in the air, man.
It's in the air. It's in the environment. Yep.
It's all in the air. And Jesus predicted specifically, though, not just that there was going to be tension in a war. He does mention that, but he's the one who really mentions the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And there's a lot of great scholarship on this. because they've gone back and forth, and scholars love to doubt, prophecies in any context. But
Mhm.
in this is one instance, though, where scholars are pretty much in agreement that Jesus's prophecy of the fall of Jerusalem was one of these authentic moments of Jesus. It's an authentic saying of his.
Yeah, it's deep in the gospel record. It's in all the gospels,
Mm-hmm.
and again, it's in the air in first century Judaism.
And it shows up in many different ways. It's like when Jesus has his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, he says, destroy this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And of course, then John sort of has like a commentary on what he thinks Jesus meant by that, right? But that's John's commentary. We don't know, is that what Jesus really meant? So he's saying, destroy this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And then there's that instance in Mark chapter 13, verse 2, where the apostles are like marveling at like the beautiful, complex of the temple. He's like, look at these stones. And then Jesus says, you see these buildings? I tell you the truth, not one stone will be left upon another that will not be thrown down. So that's a very clear one. Even when Jesus is on the road to his crucifixion and he sees the women of Jerusalem, they're all weeping for him. He says, don't weep for me, because something's coming. Something's coming against you.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the most clear one is Luke chapter 19, verse 41. He says, behold, the days shall come upon you when your enemies shall cast up a bank around you and surround you and dash you to the ground, you and your children with you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you. I mean, it could not be more clear, that Jesus sees a full-on collision course between Rome and Jerusalem, and that the temple is going to be the center of that conflict.
Yeah.